Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. And I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today are two guests from Germany, Berlin, Germany, the BLOMSTEIN firm. Two of my friends there, Florian and Hanna Kurtz. Welcome to Embargoed.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for having us.
So I'm really glad to have you today because we're going to talk a little bit about EU sanctions. Periodically on Embargoed, we talk about EU sanctions and particularly the EU sanctions with respect to Russia. I think we've probably had 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 episodes devoted to that. I know we've talked to one of your partners, Roland Stein, about that a couple of times. And, you know, the EU sanctions against Russia have been what I think a lot of people would call a huge development in sanctions practice in the EU, because prior to that, I think the sanctions practice was probably not as large, not as coordinated. Certainly, there haven't been 14 packages of sanctions against any other country, I'm guessing. And today we're going to talk about the 14th sanctions package against Russia that went into effect, I think, in late June, although you guys can talk a little bit more about that. But with that, why don't, either Florian or Hanna, either one, just kind of give us a little background on the sanctions program and kind of where the 14th sanction package fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I start, Hanna, and then you join in.
Yep.
Yeah, the 14th sanctions package was one of these packages that took a while until it was born in Brussels. And what we've seen over the 2.5 years now that we have the Russia sanctions from 2022 in place is that the 27 member states of the European Union, of course, sometimes find it difficult to find a mutual position on Russia. All the 27 member states have to agree to a sanctions package. And every time we have something in it that might collide with the interests of one of these member states, then we have a delay. Maybe we can give you an example.
And I'm going to stop you there because that just to refresh for some of our listeners who may not be from the EU. I mean, that is the thing about EU sanctions that I think it's so hard to contemplate from the US, where you have the EU imposes a sanctions package, but as I understand it, all 30 members need to vote to agree on it, and then the member states then have their own enforcement mechanism. So even though there's an EU sanctions package, it may be different in every country. So sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to lay that background because I know you guys deal with it all the time.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. It is like that. All the 27 member states have to agree upon one sanctions package. And if one member state does not agree, we don't have a sanctions package. And the 27 member states are different. Let me put it that way. There are some big ones, some smaller ones, and they all have their own interests. And for example, when we look at Belgium, they were always interested in delaying sanctions on diamonds because in Antwerp, in Belgium, they have this huge diamond trade hub. And when it comes to Hungary, for example, they are currently building a nuclear power plant together with Russian companies. And they have an interest in getting an exemption for nuclear power plants in Hungary, even if it is prohibited to work together with Russian companies. And that's the reason why it always takes a lot of time. But finally, we got the 14th sanctions package at the end of June. And what was it basically about? Maybe just, I don't know, 2 or 3 main topics. I think it is all about diversion and circumvention, right? So the EU recognized that circumvention is a huge problem, a huge topic, and they are trying to prevent that by some additional measures, even by kind of adopting or by applying the EU sanctions extraterritorially, what we usually don't do because it is evil, others do it, but we, the good Europeans, we don't do it. But now we started, step by step introducing kind of extraterritorial sanctions because the EU just recognized that it is necessary if you want to, prevent circumvention. And that is
Well, it is. it is, one of the things that's been interesting just watching from this side of the Atlantic, the EU and the UK, in terms of extraterritoriality, is that I know for many years that has been a very contentious subject with respect to our sanctions against Iran and our sanctions against Cuba. The problem, as I think the EU and the UK are seeing, is that when you try to impose sanctions against a country and you don't have extraterritorial application, they're really easy to evade. And so that's really the dilemma, is if you want them to work, you have to start thinking about those things, even though it seems very unfair. But sorry to interrupt.
No, that's absolutely the point. And what the EU is saying, they say we don't apply the Russia sanctions extraterritorially, but we are getting closer and closer to that. We can talk about, some specific topics later. But what we also see is that the EU started listing companies on the sanctions lists that are not from Belarus or Russia, for, let's say, being involved in trade businesses that are in favor of the Russian defense industry. And I don't want to have, a full discussion about international law, but if you start listing companies for just, let's put me that way, for doing business that is allowed in their country, right? Then it is kind of an extraterritorial application. And I understand that it is necessary, but it's kind of a policy shift by the European Union. It's not a full extraterritorial application to the subsidiaries of EU companies, for example, but they start getting closer and closer to that.
Yep.
And
well, it is a big... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to underline that we should stress that the applicability of the regulation is still limited to Europeans, so being natural or legal persons within the EU, or vessels or whatever who belong to a member state, and not to anyone else. And this changed with the 14th sanctions package.
And how, and just so I understand it, so the difference in terms of EU companies, what about an EU subsidiary? So it's owned by an EU company, but it is a foreign company organized under a law that's not inside the EU. How does the 14th package apply to those companies?
Yeah, the idea was pretty easy at the very beginning when the Commission made the first draft of the 14th package. They said European companies are accountable for any violations of the Russia sanctions by their subsidiaries, and they said there is an assumption that the EU companies are accountable for violations of Russia sanctions by their subsidiaries. And the idea behind this is not to say that the EU sanctions directly apply to the subsidiaries, but there is another obligation for European companies to ensure that their subsidiaries do not infringe EU sanctions against Russia. And that is kind of an indirect application of the sanctions to non-European companies, because how do you do that effectively if you are a European company or an EU company? You just can tell your subsidiary in a third state, don't do business with Russia if it is prohibited under the EU-Russia sanctions regulation, right? And then they have to do it. And that's the point, right? You have kind of an indirect application, because the European companies are fined by their member states of the European Union if they don't undertake the measures that are necessary to ensure that their subsidiaries are not violating EU sanctions. This very first draft was problematic, by the way, from the German perspective, because the Germans consider it being a bit strict, that there is an assumption that you are responsible for any violations of a subsidiary. So they lobbied against this new provision in the sanctions regulation. What we have now is even worse. It is basically the same content, but just unclear, because now the new provision has the so-called best effort clause in it, saying that EU companies have to undertake best effort to ensure that their subsidiaries are not, how do they put it, not to take part in activities that undermine the EU sanctions against Russia. And I mean, it's not very helpful to use this language, because what is the difference between ensuring that they do not violate sanctions, or that they do not, take part in activities that undermine the sanctions? Nobody knows what is really the difference. It's just, unclear language that maybe gives European companies the chance to follow a less strict approach when applying these sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed about it is it goes beyond what the U.S. does with respect to the Russia sanctions. The U.S. either has you're in or you're out. And with the Russia sanctions for subsidiaries, the subsidiaries are out. The U.S. sanctions against Russia only apply directly to U.S. persons. And if a foreign subsidiary, and particularly one in Russia, is not a U.S. person, which it never is, it's usually a Russian organized company, or if it's in Germany, it'd be a German organized company. The U.S. sanctions against Russia don't directly apply. Now, if a U.S. person gets involved in whatever the subsidiary is doing, then the sanctions would apply to the U.S. person, and they might apply to the entire transaction, so the subsidiary could be on the hook. But if the subsidiary acts completely independently from a U.S. person with respect to the Russia sanctions, there's no legal liability for that. And that actually comes up a lot, because U.S. companies have basically taken two tacks with respect to divesting from Russia. One tack is that they will just exit. They'll get out. The other is that they basically just place a wall around their Russian subsidiary and say, look, we can't control what you do, and the fact is that our guess is that there is almost no way to do business in Russia without violating U.S. sanctions. So we're taking all U.S. persons out of Russia, and what happens in Russia stays in Russia. Now, that is a very risky strategy, because U.S. persons as a parent are almost always involved in the subsidiary's conduct. But it is one permissible route in U.S. law if you can do it effectively, which most companies can't, but they sometimes try it. But it's allowed because of that rule that the U.S. sanctions only apply to U.S. companies, which is different than Iran or Cuba. Our sanctions against Iran and Cuba apply to foreign companies that are owned or controlled by U.S. companies, but they don't for Russia. So the EU has gone beyond, at least as I understand it, where we've gone. And I don't know how how a company navigates this whole best efforts thing. Hanna, I mean, if you have any thoughts on how a company might do that, I'd love to hear them.
Well, that's the question of a lot of our clients. What can we do? What should we do? Because no one wants to get sanctioned for any violation of the EU law. So we're still waiting for some clarification by the EU Commission, and then of the member states, but always the Commission first, who gives best practices or FAQs. So that's the first hint for the companies how to act and what to do. And then another step would be just divest from Russia and do your best to be compliant with all your subsidiaries, even though they are in third countries. That's a very big question for all our clients at the moment.
It's really hard. I mean, because let's say you have a Russian subsidiary. I mean, at least the way that the U.S. sanctions work, and I'm assuming the EU sanctions work, you can't deal with a number of the banks that are in Russia. So if your Russian subsidiary is governed by U.S. sanctions law, they can't deal with Russian banks. As I understand Russian law, it's illegal to refuse to deal with banks simply on the basis of sanctions. And so how would you operate in Russia where you're compliant with US law, but also compliant with local law? It seems really hard to do it. And the best effort that a US company could make is to order its subsidiary to comply with US law, which would mean that it would be out of compliance with Russian law, and it'd be really hard to stay in Russia for very long if that's kind of the company's choice. So I don't know how these things are supposed to work in practice.
Yeah,
you're getting clarification.
Yeah, I mean, in the situation in the EU had been like in the US before, right? So companies have subsidiaries, and they said, as long as we don't confirm any business that you do, or as long as we don't ask you as our subsidiary to do business with Russia that is prohibited under the sanctions regulation, do it. We just, we don't want to know. Do whatever you want to do. You are, let's say, a company from Turkey or Kazakhstan, and you're free to do whatever you want to do as long as no Europeans are involved and no European products are, supplied by us. And that was...
Which is the U.S. rule. I mean, that's basically the U.S. rule.
But that's an easy one, right? So just keep your hands off your subsidiary, and then they can do their business, right? And now we have a situation where it would have been easy to say, like with the U.S. In Iran, if you are an EU-owned or controlled subsidiary, you're not allowed to do any business with Russia. Then you fall within the scope of application of the EU sanctions regulation. But we couldn't do that because that's an extraterritorial application of EU sanctions. And as I said, we don't do that because it's illegal. And now they had to find...
Fair point.
And we had to find a middle way. And that's, I mean, from a perspective of legal certainty, it's a catastrophe because the companies say, if they want to be fully compliant, they say, okay, then we have to pull out because we don't want to have any risk that we violate the sanctions. And another question that is interesting in that regard is, Tim, just imagine you have a EU company with a subsidiary somewhere in a third state, and they do fully comply with the EU sanctions regulation, the subsidiary, but the parent company does not undertake any efforts to ensure that. You could still have a violation of this obligation by the EU company because they don't undertake any efforts, even if you have no violation of the Russia sanctions by the subsidiary. And that's just, the outcome of bad, lawmaking by the EU.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, so in a lot of places you hear discussion about a compliance defense, and this is kind of a compliance defense, but it sounds like there's also a compliance offense. That is, if you are not engaging in your best compliance efforts, you've actually violated the law, even if you get lucky and don't violate sanctions anyway.
Right. Correct.
Interesting. Well, why don't we talk about circumvention? Because I know that's been a big issue in the U.S., and I think it sounds like Article 12 is a prohibition to circumvent these restrictive measures. What kind of, can you sketch out a little bit what the EU has done with respect to circumvention and kind of where this new measure fits in?
Yes, so Article 12 is nothing new in the Russia sanctions. It just has been amended. So before the 14th Sanctions package, it was always a circumvention if you did any action that undermined the EU law or the EU sanctions willfully. But now this is broadened, so it's already a circumvention that could be sanctioned or is prohibited if you are aware that any participation that may have an effect of circumventing the sanctions, and you accept that possibility that it may circumvent the sanctions, that is already prohibited and may be, sanctioned by your competent authority. It's an offense. And to use the Latin word. I don't know if you also have this in American law. It's dolus eventualis. So you do something and accept its consequences. Yes, that's what Article 12 has been amended to.
So basically now, essentially, if the circumvention takes place, it's problematic regardless of the mental state, or is there any mental state that is required at this point?
No, you have to know that your action may undermine EU sanctions, and that the action, that's at least a possibility too. So if you are not aware that it might be prohibited or violate a sanction, then it's no offense. So it's
got it. So it sounds pretty similar.
Negligence.
So what we have in the U.S. is a lot of our laws apply, or our sanctions laws apply, if you know, or if you should have known. So essentially, it's and should have known is basically what are the facts out there at the time, even if that you were potentially aware of, that should have told you this is something that is going to involve Russia. Or it comes up a lot more with respect to Iran, although I've had a couple of investigations at this point where that was the real question: was there was diversion, but did the company know, or should they have known? And the should have known standard is pretty hard. I don't know whether the EU has defined kind of what is this kind of level of knowledge that's below actual knowledge, but is what you should have known or may have known.
Yeah, that is up to the member states' criminal law, but
interesting.
it makes things more complicated.
27 definitions of what you should have known.
Right. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's always one of these cases where if you have a bad feeling, and if have indications that something is not really 100% correct, and you act anyways because you say, okay, even if there is a problem, I don't care.
Right.
I don't want to know. I don't want to have the goods in Russia. I don't really care, but I understand that there could be something that is not really okay, and I act anyways. Then I'm in, and that is something, there was kind of a clarification rather, because it is something that the European Court of Justice had already decided before, and they use it as a clarification. And what we also have is, I believe you have talked about this in other episodes of Embargoed, but if you take a look at the numbers of goods that are exported to neighboring countries of Russia, then you would see that, I don't know, several 100% higher sale of product X to Kazakhstan, and 1,000% to Serbia, and I don't know, all these measurable increases of the export of goods to specific countries. And we all know why that is. But the problem is to target it. And the EU is trying to do it by several prohibitions that are, I think it's worth a try, but I'm not really convinced that it will have the effects it should have, because we also have this no Russia clause that was in the sanctions regulations before the 14th package, and it was now broadened and does also cover, let's say, IP, business security. It's specific knowledge, business secrets, and they broadened this no Russia clause a little bit, trying to also cover other aspects that might be of a value for Russian companies, but that will not really change the problem, right? We also have a kind of a compliance obligation now that will come into effect as of Christmas this year, that you have to do a risk assessment when you are exporting very specific and sensitive goods that are called the common high priority goods that are of essential interest for Russia. And you have to do a risk assessment and you have to document that. But, that's something, companies usually already do when they do export compliance. So what we are seeing is that the EU is really trying to target circumvention and evasion. But the outcome will probably not be as wished for by the EU.
Well, let me see so I want to make sure I understand kind of where things are with this. So if I am a company in Germany and I am sending a bunch of things to Turkey, and I'm now sending a lot more of my goods to Turkey than I was in 2022 when I sent a lot of the same goods to Russia. How the fact that the volume increases, is that evidence that I should know that diversion is going on? Would that be enough under the new standard? Do we think?
Yeah.
Just the volume increase.
I mean, it depends on the specific situation, right? I mean, if you have a customer, let's say in Turkey, who is producing more goods now because the Russians cannot do it anymore, and they are producing it for the Turkish market, and these products were bought from Russia before, then you might have a situation where you say, yeah, that might make sense because the production is getting out of Russia into Turkey, and then they are in need of more specific products just to produce goods in Turkey to sell it in Turkey or other countries. But if you have, let's say, a trader in Turkey, and there is no reason to believe that the Turkish market increased by 600% in the last 2 years. Then the goods have to go somewhere, right? And that's exactly the point where you always have these situations in the discussions with the clients where where you are in a position where you say, wow, it's one of these situations where it's completely unclear. Yes, you have an indication and ask the customer what they are doing. And then the customers give you an answer. And sometimes the answer is satisfying and then you can do it. And sometimes it's not satisfying. And then you are in a situation where you should probably say, okay, I have indications that something is going on there and that I should not do that anymore. Absolutely. But it's always...
So it sounds like you've got to look. I mean, that's really the question. When you see the numbers have changed, you've got to look and find out, is this a situation where it's, the change is reasonable and doesn't involve diversion, or is this a situation where what's happening is that all the stuff we used to sell to Russia is just now going to Russia through Turkey? That's I guess the question you've got to run down once you see the volume increase. The no Russia clauses. So my understanding is that the EU mandates that when you sell to, say, Turkey, that you have to have a no re-export to Russia. Right. So that and so it sounds like those clauses strengthened. What in particular about those clauses got tougher?
Yeah, maybe we have to clarify that it's not a general obligation. So if you sell or export food or something like this, tennis rackets to Turkey, you wouldn't be obliged to include a no Russia clause. But if you export or sell certain items that are listed as sanctioned goods in the annexes to the regulation, so certain annexes, and export this to a third country, which is not a member country of the EU, then you have to contractually prohibit your third country partner to re-export this item or good to Russia. So talking about the extraterritoriality with regard to the best efforts, this would be another link to extraterritoriality by this No Russia clause. So it's not public law, then it's civil law, but yeah, your contractual partners in third countries have to comply.
Right. You're telling them in your contract that they can't engage in a transaction between, and we'll pick on Turkey one more time, between Turkey and Russia, if you sell this to them from Germany to Turkey.
Correct.
Okay. And it's only for certain goods, it sounds like. That, and my guess is that these are goods that are important to the Russian war effort, or at least in high demand in Russia for the military.
Yes.
And it does now cover. Sorry, Hanna.
No, go for it.
And it does now also cover IP rights related to these goods, business secrets related to these goods. So the problem was that while customers in a third country said, "Okay, we agree, we won't supply these very sensitive goods to Russia," what they could still do is to provide a Russian customer with IP rights in order to produce the goods themselves, or with business secrets, or something related to these goods. So the EU closed this loophole by saying you don't only have to require your customers in a third country to agree not to deliver the goods to Russia, but also to not deliver any business secrets, IP rights, and so on that are related to these goods to Russia.
Right. So they can't just pass along the plans. Oh, sorry, Hanna.
Right.
Correct. No, I just wanted to add that the No Russia clause for IPR and trade secrets is even one step further than the normal No Russia clause, which is related to goods, because you don't only have to prohibit the re-exportation to Russia to your customer, so your direct customer in a third country, but you also have to require your customer that he prohibits prohibits his customer, so that would be the third in the chain, also doesn't re-export to Russia. So heightened requirements that go beyond just your direct customer in whatever third country you're producing to. Interesting. It looks like there's also. Oh, go ahead, Florian.
I just wanted to add that for the US people listening to the podcast, the good thing is that the US is not covered by this obligation. There is an exemption for the US, so when it comes to US customers, we are fine, right?
So you're carving us out of your extraterritorial sanctions, which I know we appreciate.
Right.
So it looks like, not only are there no Russia clause requirements, and they're broadened now for particular goods that are sent to third countries. What about the due diligence requirements? So explain those to me, because it sounds like those either were added or expanded by the 14th Sanctions package.
Yeah, correct. And this clause also covers only very sensitive goods. These common high priority goods that are basically 50 goods that are of utmost importance for Russia. And if a company is selling these goods to a third country, the US again excluded, then they have to conduct specific compliance measures. But to be honest, I would say it's kind of standards. They have to take a risk-based approach, and then to conduct a risk assessment, whether or not there is a risk that these goods will finally end up in Russia. And if they find such a risk, then they have to take preventive measures. And they only have to do it if these very sensitive goods are concerned. But honestly, if you have other not super sensitive goods that are listed in the EU-Russia regulations and that are prohibited from being sold to Russia, that's exactly what you do, right? So if you are selling to a third country, you will still ask your customers for an end-use certificate, or you will ask them to to confirm that they are not selling these goods to Russia, because it is prohibited to sell listed goods directly or indirectly to Russia. So there are now these written compliance obligations when you're dealing in these very sensitive goods. But I mean, it's rather, I would say we are talking about standard measures that you would, apply anyways when you are dealing with goods that are listed in the EU sanctions regulations against Russia.
It sounds like these are basically codifying things that most companies are doing already, just formally requiring
or should be doing, right?
Yes. Or should be. And the ones that aren't have problems, the ones, our clients are going to be totally fine with this because they're already doing it, but other people's clients might not be. So now they've got to get with the program.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So any other big changes from the 14th sanctions package that we should know about?
So that were already a lot of big changes for most of our clients and EU companies. But the annexes and some of the provisions in the EU regulation have also been broadened. So companies are required to check these annexes, whether their goods or technology is now listed. So that takes a lot of effort and time, and not every company has a huge compliance department, right? So it's not always that easy, especially if you are just, if your item or your good is just part of something bigger, that might also cause trouble, because you never know, am I still allowed to sell this? Or is it, even though my good is not listed on in the annexes, but the end product is given a car. So what should I do? What can I do? That's quite difficult for clients and companies.
Yeah, we're seeing that too. I mean, so our lists in the U.S. have broadened. We have basically at the time of the war broke out, the U.S. essentially said any item that is listed on the dual use list, we call the commerce control list, now requires a license to go to Russia. And then here's a supplement that will tell you other items by harmonized tariff code that also can't go to Russia without a license. And that list has broadened substantially. It seems to broaden every couple of months. And to your point, Hanna, it's very hard for clients to keep up with that list unless they have kind of a relatively large compliance department, because it's changing quite frequently. It sounds like the EU one is too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at the same time that the EU was acting and carving out the U.S. items going to the U.S. from a lot of these requirements, the U.S. was doing some similar things. So the U.S. In June expanded secondary sanctions, our favorite secondary sanctions on Russia. So at the outset of the war, the U.S. really disclaimed secondary sanctions almost entirely. So the U.S. has what we would call a derivative sanction that applies in almost all the programs. It's usually not very well known, but it says that any person who provides material, technological, or financial support to a sanctioned party can themselves be sanctioned. So it's kind of a form of secondary sanctions, but it's pretty common, and the standard for material support is actually pretty high. Usually it requires more than one transaction. But in December, the U.S. started to impose more, traditional secondary sanctions as part of the Ukraine-Russia program, or the one related to this invasion of Ukraine. And those were directed to financial institutions, foreign financial institutions only. And really, not, even though we haven't formally carved out EU financial institutions, these sanctions are not really directed at all towards the EU, and they haven't been applied to EU companies, at least almost never. They're really directed towards Chinese companies, UAE companies, Turkish companies, Kazakh companies that the U.S. believes that the financial institutions there might be doing things to engaging in significant transactions with not only sanctioned parties, but sanctioned parties in Russia that are really contributing to the Russian war effort. So in June, the U.S. expanded those. It started with kind of a very limited number of sanctions parties that would qualify, but now the number of sanctioned parties has gone. Any sanctioned party that engaged, if a foreign financial institution, a bank, does a transaction with that sanctioned party, it's potentially subject to secondary sanctions. So broadened secondary sanctions at the same time the EU is doing this. So we've got our own additions to the extraterritoriality. I think, again, to get at this problem of, the US and the EU are working together kind of hand in glove to stop certain items from going to support the Russian war effort. But if the rest of the world doesn't join those sanctions, and there's a big part of certainly Asia and the Middle East that have not, it's very hard to make them effective. And so this was an attempt to make them effective. And then along the same lines, I think that one of the things I think the U.S. has seen, to your point, Hanna, you were talking about kind of trade secrets, technological information going to Russia, even though the parts aren't. The U.S. imposed an IT services ban on U.S. persons sending items to Russia, certain items to Russia with respect to IT services, providing certain IT services. The Commerce Department imposed restrictions on providing IT goods, IT items to Russia. So it looks like we're kind of following along the same path that you are at around the same time, still working together on sanctions policy. But I think both sides of the Atlantic are seeing that even if it's a multilateral effort among the allies, that there's still a lot of things that are getting into Russia that are allowing them to continue the war effort. So I guess we'll probably see more of this as long as the war goes on.
Yeah, and I think...
So go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add that we are learning, right, together, because when we look in the past, when we had these different sanctions regulations with regard to Iran, and then, all these disputes between the EU and the US about extraterritorial application, and then blocking regulations and back and forth, the sanctions regimes were not always very much aligned. And, I think that currently we are learning from each other, and it could be kind of a template in the future when we'll have, other sanctions, maybe in East Asia, maybe in Iran again. And I think that, the reason why we all this is extremely sad when we look at Ukraine, but I think that we will also learn when it comes to good and effective sanctions that are implemented by the EU, the US, and other partners together in the future, when there will other scenarios and situations where we need them.
Yeah, that goes to, I guess, what will probably be my final, at least, topic of questions. Is it your perception that the regulators are getting better at this? I know when I talked with Roland and some other folks from the EU around the beginning of the war, I mean, it was the EU was very new at this, and there were a lot of growing pains that we saw when OFAC was new too. It's just been around longer, but it was, in terms of conflicting guidance, in terms of really getting member consensus on sanctions, in terms of things like extraterritoriality to try and make the sanctions more effective. I mean, what do we see 2 years from now? Hopefully the war is not still going on, but even if it is, like, where do we see EU sanctions regulators going? Are they getting more coordinated? Is it entrenched in terms of, like, even if the war ends, there'll still be a EU sanctions infrastructure that will probably be directed somewhere else? Like, how do you see this playing out in the next 2 years?
So, Hanna, do you want?
No, I just wanted to say that you have seen more sanctions packages, so maybe you should answer this.
I mean, Tim, to be honest, it would be the easiest for me now to complain about EU sanctions, about the 27 member states, the 27 authorities in the member states that are competent for the law enforcement. And I think I have very many reasons to do that, because, we still see that that rag of 27 member states, where something is possible in one member state and another member state authority across the border takes a different view and they prohibit it. And of course, in some parts, it's still a chaos, and we have these, conflicting interpretations of the sanctions regulations between member states, the Commission, the European Court of Justice. And I think this is something that we will always have because of the structure of the European Union. We are not the United States, and we will always have these problems. But I think that what we see is that the Europeans are understanding maybe better why the US acted in the past as they did when they applied their sanctions extraterritorially. And that they understand that, I said that before, but if you really want to prevent goods from going into a specific country, you cannot only look at your own citizens and companies. You have to look at these topics globally, and you have to find a solution on how you want to address circumvention. And that's what I meant. We have had all these discussions between the US and the EU on how to apply sanctions. And you know that we were not always happy in the European Union about what the US did in the past. But I've got the feeling that the Europeans are really recognizing and learning that maybe some things that the US did in the past, were based and reasonable, because it's the only possibility to prevent circumvention and diversion. And that's what I meant, that I believe that the EU will have a larger toolbox in the future in order to address very specific problems they come across when they try to enforce their sanctions.
It's a great point. I can tell you from over here, the growth and the maturity of the EU sanctions authorities, the UK sanctions authorities as well, over the last 2+ years has been really impressive. And I think, it's natural that you would struggle with things like extraterritoriality. I think the US did too, and then it just decided that was what it took to accomplish the foreign policy goal, or at least that was the perception. And so they've gone on, even though our allies have not been pleased at various points in time, particularly with respect to Cuba and Iran. But it has, for the most part, gotten its act together with, providing guidance, knowing what businesses need. Still, it's not perfect. From this side of the Atlantic, even OFAC is still struggling with some of those same concepts, but the EU sanctions authorities have, I think, more hurdles because of the need for buy-in from all 27 member states, and then the enforcement happening in all 27 member states. I've said many times before that if all 50 states in the US had their own sanctions policy, I just can't even imagine how that would work. And it's been very impressive that the EU has made as much progress as it has. So with that, Hanna, I want to give you the last word. Let's hear it.
No, I just wanted to say, let's all hope for the unbelievable that this war ends soon, so we don't have any more packages.
Yes, that would be nice. And no more packages going forward, because I heard Florian mention the potential for East Asia sanctions, and I can tell you that if we thought the Russia sanctions were a nightmare, I just can't even imagine what a sanctions package would look like if there were ever a conflict over in East Asia. So let's hope we never see that.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on. Hanna, thank you. And
thank you.
Florian, thank you. And to everyone listening out there, thanks for listening, and stay sanctions free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.